Did Patrick Mahomes just get caught on the wrong side of the timeline? Because a few weeks ago, he made what sounded like a routine, competitive comment about young quarterbacks needing to prove it before the business side starts running ahead of the football side. It wasn't loud. It wasn't disrespectful. It was veteran talk. But the internet heard it, saved it, archived it, and then something happened. Reports surfaced that Shedeur Sanders secured a massive partnership tied to Saudi Arabia's public investment fund. Not just a typical endorsement, but a structural move connected to global sports expansion. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about arm strength or draft boards anymore. It was about influence, money, power, and timing. Now fans are replaying that old clip under every headline about Shedeur's rise and asking one simple question. Did Mahomes underestimate what was being built right in front of him? Because this isn't just football anymore. It's narrative control, and the timeline just flipped. It didn't explode when it happened. That's what makes it interesting. During a normal media availability, Patrick Mahomes was asked about the next wave of quarterbacks entering the league. Cameras rolling, reporters gathered, the usual off-season conversation about young talent and the future of the position. When Shedeur Sanders' name entered the discussion, Mahomes leaned into a familiar principle. Let the tape speak first. Earn respect on the field. The NFL sorts hype out quickly. On the surface, that's completely fair. The league is ruthless. Plenty of quarterbacks enter with massive brand momentum and disappear just as fast. Mahomes, as the face of the modern NFL, reinforcing "prove it first," sounds like competitive accountability, not hostility. He didn't shout. He didn't mock. He didn't directly call Shedeur out in a sharp way. But there was tone. A half smile, a layered phrasing, the kind of answer that sounds polished but carries weight underneath it. He didn't need to say Shedeur's name in the most pointed part of the statement. Everyone in the room understood who the comment was orbiting. Reporters clipped it. Analysts debated it. Social media bookmarked it. At the time, most people treated it like veteran hierarchy. The established superstar reminding the league that branding doesn't replace production. And in isolation, that's a reasonable stance. But sports narratives don't live in isolation. They live on timelines, and timelines can shift fast. Because what sounded like competitive standard setting at first began to feel different once the business headlines started moving. When you tell someone to prove it first, and then weeks later that same person secures a global-level partnership that reshapes the business conversation around them, context changes. Not because Mahomes was necessarily wrong, but because the scale of what happened next made that earlier comment feel smaller than the moment it was trying to frame. And once the timeline flipped, the internet did what it always does. It connected the dots. Then the headline dropped. Reports began circulating that Shedeur Sanders had secured a partnership tied to Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, the same sovereign wealth powerhouse that flipped professional golf with LIV, reshaped European football through Newcastle United, and has been aggressively expanding its footprint in global sports markets. This wasn't a routine endorsement. It wasn't a sneaker launch or a limited edition collaboration. Multiple outlets described it as a structural partnership connected to long-term American football expansion. That's a completely different tier of involvement. And here why that matters. Organizations operating at the level of PIF don't move casually. They don't commit massive capital based on short-term hype cycles. They evaluate long-term growth projections, cross-market appeal, scalability, and cultural reach. Before committing to any athlete, funds like that analyze audience growth curves, global market expansion potential, brand sustainability over years, not months. So when Shedeur's name reportedly emerged as a central figure in that expansion strategy, it signaled something bigger than popularity. It suggested projection of influence, projection of market leverage, projection of global staying power. Now let's slow down. Exact financial figures have not been fully disclosed publicly, and some early reporting relies on industry sources rather than official breakdowns. But the scale was significant enough to shift the conversation immediately. Because suddenly, the narrative wasn't about whether Shedeur had proved it. It was about whether the business world had already validated him in a way that transcended traditional football milestones. And that's where the timeline became fascinating. The same "prove it first" comment that felt grounded and competitive now existed side by side with headlines about global investment and structural partnerships. It didn't make Mahomes wrong, but it made the conversation more complex. Because once the business ecosystem moves at that scale, football hierarchy and brand hierarchy don't always move at the same speed. And that's when the internet pulled the old clip back out of the archives, not as sports banter, but as contrast. And contrast changes everything. The moment the Saudi PIF reports started trending, the old Mahomes clip came back. Not quietly, not subtly. It resurfaced everywhere. Twitter threads replayed it side by side with the partnership headlines. Instagram Reels stitched the comment directly under global expansion graphics. YouTube thumbnails framed it like a before and after story. And this time, the tone wasn't neutral. When the clip first circulated, it felt like competitive hierarchy, veteran perspective reminding young quarterbacks that production comes first. Standard NFL discourse. But once the global deal entered the chat, the same words sounded different to some fans. "Prove it first" suddenly existed next to major international investment. And that juxtaposition created narrative tension. Because sports media runs on contrast. One frame shows an established superstar emphasizing traditional standards. The next frame shows a rising quarterback securing what many describe as a game-changing business partnership. That sequence doesn't require commentary. It tells its own story. Now, to be fair, Mahomes never mocked Shedeur. He never dismissed his talent. He never declared him incapable. But the internet doesn't operate on technicalities. It operates on symbolism. And symbolically, the timeline looked like this. Veteran voice questions acceleration. Young quarterback accelerates anyway. Clip resurfaces. Debate ignites. Comment sections filled up quickly. Some argued Mahomes was right, football still comes first. Others said the moment proved Shedeur was operating on a level that traditional commentary failed to anticipate. And the most interesting part, the loudest reactions weren't necessarily happening in public threads. According to insiders and media observers, conversations behind the scenes among agents, executives, players started shifting tone as well. Because when a global investment entity identifies a quarterback as part of a long-term strategic plan, that changes how people inside the industry evaluate trajectory. Not legacy, trajectory. And once trajectory becomes the focus, the conversation moves beyond rivalry. It becomes generational. And that's where things turned even more interesting, because Mahomes had to answer again. This time with the entire digital timeline watching. The moment the Saudi PIF reports started trending, the old Mahomes clip came back. Not quietly, not subtly. It resurfaced everywhere. Twitter threads replayed it side by side with the partnership headlines. Instagram Reels stitched the comment directly under global expansion graphics. YouTube thumbnails framed it like a before and after story. And this time, the tone wasn't neutral. When the clip first circulated, it felt like competitive hierarchy, veteran perspective reminding young quarterbacks that production comes first. Standard NFL discourse. But once the global deal entered the chat, the same words sounded different to some fans. Prove it first suddenly existed next to major international investment. And that juxtaposition created narrative tension. Because sports media runs on contrast. One frame shows an established superstar, emphasizing traditional standards. The next frame shows a rising quarterback securing what many describe as a game-changing business partnership. That sequence doesn't require commentary. It tells its own story. Now, to be fair, Mahomes never mocked Shedeur. He never dismissed his talent. He never declared him incapable. But the internet doesn't operate on technicalities. It operates on symbolism. And symbolically, the timeline looked like this. Veteran voice questions acceleration. Young quarterback accelerates anyway. Clip resurfaces. Debate ignites. Comment sections filled up quickly. Some argued Mahomes was right. Football still comes first. Others said the moment proved Shedeur was operating on a level that traditional commentary failed to anticipate. And the most interesting part, the loudest reactions weren't necessarily happening in public threads. According to insiders and media observers, conversations behind the scenes among agents, executives, players started shifting tone as well. Because when a global investment entity identifies a quarterback as part of a long-term strategic plan, that changes how people inside the industry evaluate trajectory. Not legacy, trajectory. And once trajectory becomes the focus, the conversation moves beyond rivalry. It becomes generational. And that's where things turned even more interesting, because Mahomes had to answer again. This time with the entire digital timeline watching. Here's the part that makes this conversation bigger than two quarterbacks exchanging subtle words. For years, the skepticism around Shedeur Sanders hasn't centered on mechanics. Scouts who actually study film rarely question his arm talent, processing speed, or football IQ. Those traits are visible. The criticism usually drifts somewhere else. His visibility, his brand presence, his cultural reach. There's been a quiet tension in parts of the football establishment that treats high visibility with caution, almost like marketability and credibility must operate in separate lanes. It's a strange paradox. Quarterbacks are marketed as franchise faces. They're built into billion-dollar brands. But when a young quarterback enters the league already possessing global attention, some voices instinctively lean skeptical. Let him prove it first. That phrase carries more weight when it's directed at someone who already commands headlines, because it suggests that brand velocity should wait for traditional milestones. Now insert the Saudi PIF partnership into that narrative. If the reports are accurate, this wasn't driven by viral clips or social media impressions alone. Sovereign wealth funds don't operate like casual sponsorship agencies. They assess long-term asset value. They evaluate market scalability. They invest based on growth projections, not momentary hype. So when a fund of that magnitude reportedly identifies Shedeur as part of a broader American football expansion strategy, it reframes the conversation. It says the brand and the football aren't separate. It says the visibility isn't a distraction. It's leverage. That doesn't diminish Mahomes' achievements. His rings remain. His resume stands untouched. But it does highlight a generational shift. The old blueprint said, win first, monetize later. The emerging blueprint suggests something different. Build both simultaneously. Because in today's NFL economy, influence isn't earned exclusively through playoff wins anymore. It's earned through cultural presence, cross-market appeal, and global scalability. And when those elements align early in a career, they don't wait for permission. That's what makes this moment feel less like a rivalry and more like evolution. Which brings us to the final layer, what this shift means for how quarterbacks are valued moving forward, both on Sundays and far beyond them. What we're really watching isn't Mahomes versus Shedeur. It's the old model meeting the new one. For decades, the quarterback formula followed a predictable path: win games, stack accolades, secure championships, and then the business side scales accordingly. Rings first, global leverage second. That latter worked in a media era where exposure was limited, and endorsement growth followed on field dominance. But the NFL doesn't operate in that ecosystem anymore. Today's quarterback isn't just a field general. He's a media entity, a cultural signal, a cross-market brand accelerator. And Shedeur Sanders fits that evolution almost perfectly. He entered the league with built-in visibility, a nationally followed college arc, a polarizing spotlight that didn't wait for draft night to switch on. Some saw that spotlight as noise. Global investors reportedly saw it as projection. That's the difference. In the modern NFL, brand velocity and football development can move in parallel. One doesn't have to wait for the other to mature fully. And that parallel growth can feel disruptive to traditionalists. Because historically, quarterbacks earned expanded influence after stacking achievements. Now, influence can grow while achievements are still in progress. That doesn't mean football performance becomes irrelevant. It still defines longevity. It still determines legacy. But the commercial blueprint has widened. Athletes are no longer just endorsers. They're equity participants, strategic partners, expansion anchors. If the Saudi PIF partnership unfolds as reported, it signals something bigger than a marketing win. It signals recognition of long-term commercial gravity. And commercial gravity shifts perception quickly. Mahomes built his empire after proving himself as the league's best. That path remains valid. Shedeur appears to be building influence while proving himself. That's the generational pivot. Not better, not worse, different. And when models change, moments like the original prove it first comment become time capsules, snapshots of a standard that may already be evolving in real time. So the real tension isn't whether Mahomes was wrong. It's whether the definition of proof has quietly expanded. And if that expansion continues, the next wave of quarterbacks won't just be evaluated by touchdown totals. They'll be measured by trajectory. Which brings us to the final question. Does acknowledgement even matter anymore? Or has the contrast already done the talking? So now we land on the question that's dividing the timeline. Does Patrick Mahomes owe Shedeur Sanders a direct acknowledgement, a clearer statement, something more definitive than a measured post-practice response? On one side, the answer is simple. No. Mahomes spoke from a competitive standpoint. He emphasized earning respect through performance. That principle built his own legacy. He wasn't disrespectful. He wasn't inflammatory. He defended a standard that most veterans believe in. Competition doesn't require apology. But here, where nuance enters, timing alters perception. When a prove it first comment resurfaces directly under headlines about a major global partnership, it creates contrast. And contrast invites reinterpretation. Not because Mahomes attacked Shedeur, but because the scale of what followed reframed the earlier tone. And that's the part the internet locks onto. In today's media environment, narrative control isn't just about what you say. It's about how your words age. Mahomes didn't retract his stance. He didn't double down either. He managed the moment. He acknowledged Shedeur's momentum carefully without contradicting his original principle. That's veteran composure. But acknowledgement in 2026 doesn't look the same as acknowledgement in 2006. Sometimes it's not about saying, "I was wrong." Sometimes it's about recognizing that the landscape changed faster than expected. And here's the truth that makes this conversation bigger than either quarterback. This isn't really about apology. It's about evolution. The league is shifting. Athlete value is expanding. The lines between football proof and commercial validation are blurring. So when fans ask whether Mahomes underestimated Shedeur, what they're really asking is whether the old standard underestimated the speed of the new model. And maybe the contrast between those two moments, the comment and the partnership, already answered that question without anyone needing to say it out loud. Because sometimes narrative correction doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from acceleration. And acceleration doesn't wait for permission. Which leaves one final thought hanging in the air. What happens when the rest of the league fully realizes the blueprint just expanded? Here's the part that really changes the temperature. Shedeur Sanders never responded. No tweet. No press conference clapback. No subtle social media shade. He didn't argue the standard. He didn't challenge the hierarchy. He didn't try to win the moment. He just kept building. And that's what makes this story powerful. Because when you argue online, it feels temporary. When you secure a reported global partnership tied to long-term expansion strategy, it feels structural. That's not noise. That's leverage. And leverage doesn't require permission. Patrick Mahomes' legacy is secure. His championships aren't fading because another quarterback lands a major business move. His resume remains elite. But what happened here wasn't about diminishing a legacy. It was about expanding a ceiling. For years, quarterbacks were told the path was linear: perform first, brand later, earn respect, then scale. Shedeur's arc suggests the path can be simultaneous. Perform while scaling. Build while proving. Influence while developing. That doesn't replace football. It amplifies it. And that amplification is what made the earlier, "prove it first" remark feel smaller once the partnership headlines hit. Not wrong, just outpaced. The modern quarterback isn't just competing on Sundays. He's competing in markets, in equity rooms, in global expansion strategies. And if the reports about this PIF partnership hold their scale, it signals that Shedeur isn't being viewed as a short-term endorsement asset. He's being viewed as a long-term sports property. That's different. That's generational. So maybe this was never about Mahomes versus Shedeur. Maybe it was about witnessing the moment when the blueprint quietly shifted and realizing it happened faster than expected. Because once ceilings move, they don't move back. And the rest of the league will have to decide whether they're operating under the old ladder or climbing the new one. Which brings us to the final thought. When acceleration reaches this level, does anyone really get to define when it's allowed to begin? And that's the real takeaway. This wasn't about beef. It wasn't about rings. It wasn't about tearing down a legend to elevate a newcomer. It was about timing. Patrick Mahomes spoke from a standard that built his dynasty. Earn it on Sundays. Let the tape speak. Respect follows results. Shedeur Sanders moved in a way that suggests the definition of results is expanding. Not replacing football. Expanding it. Because in today's NFL, proof doesn't live in one lane anymore. It lives on the field, in business rooms, across global markets, and inside cultural influence. Mahomes doesn't lose anything here. But the ceiling moved. And when ceilings move, The conversation changes whether anyone formally acknowledges it or not. Shedeur didn't argue for respect. He built leverage. And leverage doesn't need validation. It just needs momentum. And right now, momentum isn't asking for permission.